So imagine this. You magnify the size of the apocalypse, right? So it becomes a world-ending Ragnarok. Then you magnify the size of the bureaucratic state because you have to in order to deal with that apocalypse, okay? Then because the state is so global and large and so central, it loses its connection with the real world. It has no subsidiary organization, and then it flails about pointlessly. Now, I'm going to walk through a couple of narrative representations of that, and it'll tie it back to the imagery of Revelation. You might find this interesting. So you see that dynamic play out in the opening chapters of Genesis, because what you have is the descendants of Cain. So Cain makes improper sacrifices, and he becomes bitter and resentful, and he turns to technology. It's Cain's descendants that turn to technology first. They build the first cities, and then the city becomes corrupt. It becomes corrupt in the direction of the Tower of Babel. And now the Tower of Babel is a ziggurat, right? It's a stepped pyramid. And at that time, the potentates of the Middle East were competing to build the largest ziggurats. They were trying to build towers to heaven to glorify themselves. And that's the subtext of the Tower of Babel story. So what happens is that the ultimate Tower of Babel is erected to reach to the sky, and that's a challenge to the supremacy of God. And the consequence of that is that the cosmos, the spirit of the cosmos, the creative producer of the cosmos, makes all those who inhabit the tower unable to communicate with one another. So they start to lose even the ability to share concepts, and the structure collapses. And it's because that Tower of Babel is too large, it reaches too high, it's too uniform, and it's destined to failure. Of course, that begs the question, what's the alternative to that? But I would say the entire remaining biblical corpus is actually an attempt to answer that question, but it's very germane. Now, that imagery is picked up again in the book of Revelation. So one of the central images in the book that I think is very relevant, imagine that the book of Revelation is trying to conceptualize the apocalypse as such, the manner in which things deteriorate before the ultimate disaster. And so one of the main images is of a seven-headed beast. And on the back of the beast is the whore of Babylon. And it's an image of a centralizing state, a monstrous centralizing state, that's a good way of thinking about it, with multiple heads, with something like disinhibited licentiousness as its partner. That's the image. And so the notion there is that when things deteriorate to the point where apocalypse is likely, you have the construction of monstrous state-like apparatuses aligned with individual fragmentation down to the point of licentious atomization. That's a good way of thinking about it. So, you're striving towards, it seems to me in your argument, you're striving towards the hypothesis that there's something like an out-of-control gigantism that's causally related to the inability of these bureaucratic organizations to actually respond to actual occurrences in the world.
So two thoughts. There's only one law of history. I'm a historian, and that's the law of unintended consequences. And so what typically happens is that well-intentioned people come to power, identify a problem which they feel they must address, and they undertake measures to address the problem which have unintended consequences. This was true when, back in the 1960s and 70s, people persuaded themselves that there was a terrible problem of overpopulation, that Malthus was going to be vindicated, and therefore there had to be drastic population control, especially in Asia. And that turned out to have all kinds of unintended consequences. In our time, fears not just of climate change, but of dangerous technological developments have given rise to a view which my friend Nick Bostrom in Oxford exemplifies, that we need to have very, very powerful surveillance powers to prevent bad things from happening, whether it's to prevent CO2 emissions in reaching the levels of the net zero program, or whether it's to stop dangerous research being done with artificial intelligence, we need to empower the state to have even greater powers of surveillance than the mid-20th century totalitarian regimes had. And so one of the key arguments in the book Doom is that actually totalitarianism is the thing most to be feared. In the 20th century, totalitarian regimes cause way more premature death than anything else. And so the last thing we should want to do in the 21st century is to create new forms of totalitarianism out of the belief that only an all-seeing state can prevent disaster.